So, good afternoon. So I've been asked to kick off these sessions with a view of what's happening in open access in Europe, where to some extent we may be, in some countries at least, in mine, in the UK, ahead of the rest of the world. So very briefly, what I'd like to do is to say a few words about IOP and open access so you can understand the context from which I'm speaking, and then talk about what's happening in the UK, why the Finch working group came about, why and how it arrived at the recommendations that it did, how funders and others have responded to Finch and government policy, and I think next week is the first anniversary of the publication of the Finch Report, so I'd like to look at how implementation has gone in the last 12 months. I'll say a few brief words on what's happening in the rest of Europe, and I'd like to finish with a few thoughts on what funders want from open access. So IOP has been an open access publisher since 1998, when we launched the New Journal of Physics. I think at that time PLOS was probably not even a gleam in Harold Varmus's eye, so we have a good deal of experience of open access publishing, and in fact 15% of all the papers we published in our owned and co-owned journals last year were on a gold open access basis. All of our subscription journals support open access through the hybrid model, and it's important to say that we fully take the income from those hybrid APCs into account when setting our subscription prices for the journals. We also last year adopted CC BY as our standard license for gold open access publishing. We don't have the issue that medical publishers have of the potential loss of reprint income. There's very little reprint income, if any, in physics publishing. We did consult with our communities, our author communities, who expressed some reservations, and we have some reservations too about the effectiveness of CC BY in protecting the moral rights of authors. But I know David's going to talk about that later, so I won't go into that now. We've also long had a green open access policy and imposed no restrictions on things like the posting of preprints. So we're pretty well versed in open access itself. But what I'm really going to talk to you today about is what's happening in the UK more broadly. I was on the Finch working group, intimately involved in its decision making, and I'd like to say a few words about how that came about. Finch actually came about at the recommendation, at the suggestion of publishers. We found in early 2011 that our government was heading fairly rapidly towards some form of open access mandate, but on the basis of very little consultation with the major stakeholders and very little data to back up the decisions it appeared to be making. We therefore proposed the formation of a working group of all stakeholders to look at the issues, and that working group was formed under the chairmanship of Janet Finch, who's a former head of a UK university and a sociologist, and who did a really excellent job in corralling the various stakeholders and getting us to arrive at a set of agreed recommendations. I think it's important to say that our remit was not just open access, it was about expanding access, not just to UK outputs, but to outputs globally as well. But in doing so, in expanding that access, in not losing sight of things like quality and sustainability and cost. So any transition to open access would have to maintain all the good things that exist today about the scholarly communications ecosystem. And early in the process, we defined a number of success criteria. And given that the tide in the UK was very strongly in the direction of open access, we publishers on the Finch working group accepted from the start that gold was a perfectly viable publishing model, and that if funders were willing to fund it, to support it in that way, we would be willing to support it from our side as well. So there were three kind of success criteria in terms of access. One, global access to UK outputs through some form of open access publishing, and then 2 and 3, better access in the UK to the world's outputs, recognising that the UK produces only around 6% of the world's research outputs, and UK policy can only affect that 6% of publications and not the 94% from the rest of the world. And then the other success criteria had to do with what I've already mentioned, that is maintaining quality, maintaining sustainability, not significantly increasing cost, providing good quality services to authors and readers. And at the end of the process, Finch came up with 10 recommendations in what Finch herself called a balanced package. So this wasn't purely an open access set of recommendations. It was about broadly expanding access to research outputs in the UK. And the two key recommendations are those bottom two bullet points. The first, that as a whole, the UK should move in the direction of supporting gold open access. And the second, that where there was no funding for gold open access, what we shouldn't find is funders trying to impose very short 6-month mandates in green open access. So you might ask why we came to that recommendation of gold over green. And there were probably 2 or 3 reasons for it. The first one is a very straightforward objective reason. Gold open access provides immediate access with rights of reuse. Green open access provides delayed access, typically to an intermediate version of the paper, with limited, if any, rights of reuse. Objectively, gold has to be better. But we also, in the Finch Working Group, had funders represented who were willing to back up their support for gold open access with funding for it. The Wellcome Trust was represented on Finch. Wellcome has long funded gold open access, has a pretty strong mandate around it, and wanted to strengthen that mandate further. And our research councils have also long had a policy in place to support gold open access. It's simply not worked because of the way that they've implemented it. But they were willing to make funding available too. So gold came about because objectively it's a good model. It has a business model behind it which pays the publisher for the services it provides, and because in the case of the UK we had research funders who were willing to fund it. The other recommendations were, for instance, around putting in place processes to support gold with funding. So I mentioned that the research councils had had a policy in place to allow researchers to use their research grants to pay APCs for gold open access. But in fact the take-up of that was very low because the funding could only be used to pay an APC during the life of the research grant, and typically authors publish after the end of the grant period. The research councils recognised that that was a flaw in their previous approach. We also recommended minimal restrictions on reuse. We did not recommend CC BY itself. The research councils themselves took that up. And we made a number of other recommendations that would seek to extend access to non-UK outputs within the UK. I'll come back to those later. The final recommendation is an interesting one. Finch very clearly saw repositories and green open access as a complement to formal publishing and not as any kind of replacement for it. So Finch reported in June last year, and in July the UK government responded to the Finch recommendations and essentially broadly accepted them. It made a commitment to the UK moving in the direction of gold open access publishing of its research outputs. It accepted in principle that there would be an additional cost to the UK in doing so, essentially the cost of being a first mover. The UK would be paying for global access to its publications ahead of the rest of the world paying for free access in the UK to other countries' publications. Government accepted that in principle, but unfortunately put no additional funding in place to help it. And I will come back to that when I talk about implementation shortly. Government was also absolutely clear that short embargoes, 6 months in STM, 12 months in the humanities and social sciences, do not work. Government also supported the idea of licensing extensions to extend access in the UK to non-UK outputs, but again didn't put any funding in place for that, and therefore that idea has rather died a death. Government was very supportive of the publisher's proposal to provide free on-site access in public libraries to our journals, and I'll say a few more words about that later. So the Finch Recommendations and government policy can be summed up fairly well in this decision tree which the Publishers Association published in the summer of last year to try to explain graphically and fairly simply what government policy on open access meant. This decision tree was accepted by government as a fair representation of it, and also actually by the research councils. And essentially this shows the critical compromise that was made between publishers and other stakeholders in the Finch Recommendations. If funders were willing to fund Gold Open Access, publishers would be willing to support it. But there is also a carrot and a stick in the model. The carrot is that if funders support Gold Open Access with real funding, publishers will work with it. The stick is that if funders put that funding in place and publishers don't then support Gold Open Access, then funders have a right to impose short embargoes under a green model. However, if publishers support Gold Open Access and funders don't put the funding in place to support Gold, then publishers have a right to insist on a longer embargo under green. It's essentially the quid pro quo of Finch and government policy. And again, I'll come back to this when I talk about implementation. So on the same day in July last year that the UK government announced its policy, so did the research councils, which seemed a little premature to many of us, given that they had not really had a chance to absorb government policy. I should just say a word about the research councils. They fund approximately £2.7 billion, so just over $4 billion of research in the UK. They estimate that something like 26,000 papers a year come out of that research funding, which is about a fifth of total UK outputs. And the Research Council policy essentially said that over a 5-year period, beginning in 2013-14, culminating in 2017-18, they would move wholly to an open access publishing model for the outputs of their research funding. They have a strong preference for gold, but their policy allows green. Sometime later they announced the funding model which would operate here, which is block grants from the research councils to the universities for the universities themselves to use to fund APC payments. They estimated that in the first year, this current year that we're in at the moment, the funding would cover up to 45% of papers based on the price that was used in the Finch modelling. However, they initially required the universities to contribute 20% of that cost. They've now dropped that requirement because the universities refused to do so. They also imposed a requirement for CC BY, for Gold Open Access publication, and initially attempted to ignore the decision tree in terms of imposing short embargoes when there is no funding for gold. They've withdrawn that as well, except in the case of medical research. They've also commissioned what you might call a compliance database, which in theory shows whether any single journal is compliant with Research Council policies. It's frankly not fit for purpose at the moment. it is not reliable. An academic cannot go to the database and be sure that they're getting the right information on a particular journal. Essentially what the research councils did, initially at least, was to cherry pick the bits of Finch and government policy they liked and to ignore the others. The other major funder of research in the UK is the Higher Education Funding Councils. They're about to start a public consultation on open access policy. They're likely to require open access publication for all submissions to what we call the REF. The REF happens about every 6 years and essentially determines which departments in which universities get what share of the total research funding from HEFCE. While the funding council's funding for research is lower than that of the research councils, effectively this policy will affect far more papers. Anything that's not RCUK funded but is publicly funded will probably come into the frame. The funding councils say they're agnostic between gold and green, but their current position is that they already provide funding for universities which they can use to pay gold open access charges. The universities typically use that money to hire staff, and I'm not sure we've resolved just yet how that money might be redirected. However, it is likely that the funding councils will implement their policy from next year. I suspect with a lack of dedicated funding for it, it'll be green rather than gold. Implementation by the universities is at best a work in progress. Some universities are supplementing their Research Council block grants with additional funding of their own and encouraging all of their academics to publish on a gold basis. Others seem to be putting the entire grant, at least anecdotally, into their repositories and not into funding gold, including some of the largest research-oriented universities. They're terrified of the potential cost to them of gold. We looked at the university which provides more papers to us as a publisher than any other university in the UK. The cost to them of funding all of those papers on a gold basis would be 4 times what that university spends with us on journal subscriptions. For of course a fraction of the papers, they'll continue to have to buy all of those subscriptions too. So the universities, though they signed up to the Finch Recommendations during the working group process, when push comes to shove, have been less keen to put their money into funding gold, so far at least. And for once, I think I can say the publishers are the good guys here. We publishers have actually come closer to implementing the Finch Recommendations and government policy in both letter and spirit than any of the other stakeholders. Most publishers are now offering a hybrid option on all of their subscription journals. With considerable reservations, some have also accepted the use of the CC BY license. A few publishers are compliant with the Research Council's green policy on the basis, I think, that they feel they would need to charge too much for an APC. And we continue to debate with the Research Councils the form of license that the Research Councils would like to see for green open access. They'd like to see the CC BY NC license, and many publishers think that's going rather too far, considering there is no contribution to the costs of publishing from it. The one area I don't think we've been particularly successful as an industry on yet is this whole issue of double dipping, this accusation that we take hybrid APC payments and don't reflect those payments in any way in our subscription pricing. IOP does, but there are too many publishers out there who have perhaps a lack of transparent policies on this so far, which opens us to completely unnecessary attack by some of our opponents. So what have we learned after 12 months? Well, the research councils have taken to describing their policy and its implementation as a journey and not an event, which reminds me that a Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research at one British university described their implementation as a car crash a few months ago, so maybe they've needed a few repairs on that journey. But I think the mistake the research councils made was to try and put in place a policy that reflected the end point, the destination of that journey, and not how we get to that end point. So their policy on short embargoes reflects a situation where there's full funding for gold, and we're not going to have full funding for gold for many years. The other key lesson that came out of this is you cannot implement policies of this kind as a single stakeholder, as a funder, without the closest cooperation and collaboration with the other stakeholders. And I'm not just making a special plea for publishers there. The research councils implemented their policy without any discussion with the universities. And when they were then surprised when the universities rebelled at the idea of having to put in 20% of the cost. If you're going to make transitions of this kind work, you have to get all of the stakeholders on board. You also have to give the research community the clearest possible guidance on what they need to do to comply with these policies. At one point our research councils said that ambiguity was needed. Ambiguity is the last thing that's needed when we're potentially going through a transformation as fundamental as this. And it's particularly important because much of the research community is either ignorant of these policies or possibly even hostile to them. Researchers don't like to be told where and how to publish. I helped run a conference at the Royal Society in March this year for scientists about UK open access policy, and what came over most clearly was either an ignorance or a lack of interest in complying with those policies at this point. So there's a huge amount of advocacy and education required by funders and universities and publishers if we're going to make all of this work. So very briefly, I'll say a few words about one or two other initiatives in Europe. So we have several countries where open access policies are being introduced, Germany in particular, which is looking at changes in copyright law, and where also the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft is supporting gold open access, not especially successfully because it won't allow APCs to be paid for publication in hybrid journals, which has rather limited the take-up. Austria is also funding gold open access quite strongly. Denmark and Ireland have essentially rather vague policies in place, gold or green. We have the Scope 3 project run by CERN in Geneva to convert journals in high energy physics to open access. We're in the middle of a horribly complicated and difficult reconciliation process at the moment to try to establish what savings any individual institution will make on journals which convert to open access. Horribly complicated. The scope model is certainly not scalable or extensible to other disciplines. If it works in high energy physics, it's because there's a very small number of funders and a very small number of journals involved. We've got the European Union with an open access policy for its Horizon 2020 research programme. Gold or green, they say, but they've not yet resolved how gold would be funded. They're still in the old model of funding it through the research grants with all the problems that brings. And then we have an umbrella organisation called Science Europe, which published a document on principles for transition to open access in April this year. And I've extracted a few bits of that policy document here because I thought they might be of interest. One of the focuses that Science Europe is making is on the cost of publishing. It's not about access, it's not about reuse, it's about costs. They expect in the process of moving to open access to reduce costs. That second bullet point is particularly interesting as well. They're asking publishers where they're taking payments for APCs for their journals to reduce costs for the countries or even the institutions which are paying those APCs. What publishers typically are doing where they're setting off APCs against other income is to reduce subscription prices globally. Science Europe would like us to do it locally as well, which I think is their own form of double dipping. But we're increasingly hearing this demand, and I think it's going to be very, very difficult for us to respond to. We can't cut our prices twice. And Science Europe is convinced that hybrid is not a way to transition to open access. I believe they're completely wrong there, but that's their position at the moment. Which is interesting then when you look at the Global Research Council's recent statement from May this year. Many of the Science Europe funders are also members of the GRC, but the GRC in its statement in May came out with a much more, what I think is a much more reasoned approach to this, that hybrid can be a model for transitioning to open access, and again that funding agencies, universities, publishers and so on will need to work closely together to make that a reality. I'm really interested to know which members of the Global Research Council toned down the rather more strident Science Europe position on this. So I'll just give you a few links which will be there when these slides are distributed on the Finch Report on RC UK policy, which is worth a look at, on Science Europe and the GRC. But I'd like to finish with more of a question for all of the panel here that I hope we can address later on in the panel session. I think we need to ask ourselves what it is above all that funders want from open access. We've seen an evolution in the development of open access from the initial demand for access through a demand for reuse rights to go with that access, and now we're seeing this demand for substantial reductions in the cost of publishing. Now, I believe that if there were a transition over time from the current subscription model to the Gold Open Access model, there is no reason why the Gold Open Access model should be any more expensive than the current model. And in fact, I believe it might end up being somewhat less expensive, because I think there'd be considerable competition between publishers on the pricing of their APCs. There will, though, under such a transition, be additional costs for those early adopters, as some countries effectively fund open access to their publications for other countries at a point when other countries are not yet doing so. But if what funders are looking for is big cost savings, I think we have to ask them, and above all ask the research communities, what it is that they want from their scholarly publishing. Do they want traditional peer review, or do they want a different form of peer review? Do they want to publish in journals which have strong brands aimed at specific communities, or do they want to publish in large database journals which don't have those same brands for those communities? Do they want copy editing and proofing and all the other things that come with high quality production? Do they want really high quality services to authors and readers? Because some forms of publishing cost more than others. We see it with PLOS's pricing of $2,900 for APCs for medicine and biology and $1,350 for PLOS 1. It's not just a difference between not-for-profit and commercial publishers, it's a difference between different forms of publishing. And I think before we go down a road that says we've just got to cut the costs, we've got to ask ourselves what it is we want from our publishers. My view is that there's room for PLOS 1 and there's room for really high-end, highly selective journals as well. If funders want to transition to open access at absolutely minimal cost, then they're probably better off choosing the green open access model, as I think is being discussed here. But what they've got to do then is ensure that the embargo periods under the green open access model are long enough for publishers to be able to sustain their businesses, because green open access relies entirely on traditional publishing to continuing as it is, because there's no contribution to the cost, to the publisher's costs from green. So I'd like to leave you with those thoughts. I'm sure some of the other speakers today are going to address some of those issues, and thank you for your attention.